Munitions workers. One of the most dangerous and critical jobs from World War I was being a munitions worker. These brave people supplied troops who were battling on the front lines with equipment and ammunition to take down the enemy. During the First World War, a large portion of munitions workers were female, as this freed up more men to be shipped to the battlefield. By the end of the war, there were an estimated 700,000 female munition workers called munitionettes. But it wasn't exactly a fun job. These people worked incredibly long hours and in extremely dangerous conditions. TNT poisoning was a serious hazard. Because munitions workers were filling shells with dangerous chemicals, they'd often get too much exposure to TNT and it would turn their skin yellow. When this happened, they would be called canaries. Plus, the factories themselves were very dangerous. Poor ventilation, asbestos, consistent exposure to harmful chemicals, and back-breaking labor. Prinz Eugen. Originally a Nazi naval warship called a heavy cruiser, the Prinz Eugen entered service in August 1940 at the start of World War II. The U.S. ultimately captured the vessel as a war prize, and in 1946 the Prinz Eugen capsized after being nuked twice in atomic bomb tests at Bikini Atoll in the Marshall Islands, an archipelago in the South Pacific. The vessel, along with dozens of other ships, was bombed as part of Operation Crossroads, which was a series of tests to see what nuclear weapons would do to warships. Following the experiment, the Prinz Eugen was dangerously radioactive. After several failed decontamination attempts, the U.S. military towed the ship to Kwajalein Atoll, and 6 months later, it sank. It's still visible today, sitting upside down in the shallow water with the propellers sitting right above the surface. Starting in 1974, experts warned that the ship would leak oil into the ocean if it was not removed within the next 30 years. In 2018, the U.S. Army, U.S. Navy, and Republic of Micronesia worked together to remove up to 173 tanks of oil from the Prinz Eugen. 80 of the tanks were found to contain oil, which the crew carefully pumped out. Removing the oil was imperative to protecting the health of the environment and the local population, who have already suffered more than enough from the ill effects of radiation resulting from nuclear tests. The Prinz Eugen wreck remains in place as a popular diving site, and all of its oil tanks are sealed off to prevent leftover clingage from polluting the water. Trench warfare. The men in the trenches battling throughout World War I had what you might think of as the worst job in the entire world. Not only in the war, but pretty much anywhere ever. Trenches were dug as deep ditches, mostly along the Western Front, where German troops and Allied forces battled to gain territory. Trenches have been around in warfare for as long as time, but before World War I, trenches were never actually used before to this extent in armed combat. World War I, also known as the Great War, saw a wide use of trenches being dug into the ground by infantry soldiers who would live inside of them for weeks at a time, relatively protected from the fire of machine guns and artillery attacks raining down from up above. Trenches were hazardous for a few reasons. First of all, chemical warfare and poisonous gas. Gas would sometimes be wafted into trenches, filling them like fog rolling through the city streets. There was also a lot of fighting. Infantry units mounted their attacks from inside the trenches with rifles and bayonets, charging headfirst into no man's land, the area in the middle of the two opposing forces. This often resulted in huge casualties, and whichever force made it to the other side of no man's land and entered the enemy trenches, then it became a brutal and bloody struggle. To give you an idea of just how deadly trench warfare was, look at the Battle of Somme in France. According to History.com, British troops suffered a total of 60,000 deaths during the first few hours of fighting on day one. Flying Tiger Flight 739. During the Vietnam War's early stages, the U.S. military chartered a Lockheed L-1049 Super Constellation propliner known as a Flying Tiger Flight Line 739. In March 1962, it was scheduled to carry 93 U.S. Army Ranger specialists and 3 Vietnamese soldiers from Travis Air Force Base in California to Saigon, Vietnam. After stopping to refuel in Guam, the aircraft headed toward Clark Air Base in the Philippines and vanished along the way without sending out any distress calls, prompting one of the biggest sea and air searches in the history of the Pacific. The search was called off after 8 days went by with no trace of the wreckage being discovered, despite a civilian reporting having witnessed what appeared to be an in-flight explosion the night the aircraft disappeared. To this day, nobody can say with certainty what happened to Flying Tiger Flight Line 739. The plane had 9.5 hours worth of fuel left and just 6 hours to go on its journey, so it didn't run out of fuel. The Civil Aeronautics Board concluded that the aircraft likely exploded in flight due to an unknown cause, and that's sadly about as much closure as they can bring to the families of those who perished in the ordeal. War dogs. This one kind of breaks our hearts. In World War I, the dogs fought just as hard as the humans. Dogs actually played an extremely critical role and had numerous duties throughout the fighting. One of the most important jobs was guard dog. Just like your dog will guard your house today from intruders, dogs would be used by soldiers on guard duty since they were often a little better at spotting intruders. Secondly, German Shepherds were used as casualty dogs during the war. They were trained to find wounded soldiers on the battlefield. They would have medical equipment strapped to their backs to help the soldiers heal themselves or to allow nearby soldiers to act as doctors. But almost more important than carrying the medical supplies, these casualty dogs would keep soldiers company while they lay in pain on the battlefield, often being their only source of comfort in their final minutes alive. Unfortunately for the dogs, though, the enemy still saw them as enemy soldiers and would often shoot them dead given the opportunity. The dogs on the front lines were in just as much danger as the men in the trenches. How do you feel about dogs in battle? Let us know your thoughts in the comment section down below, and if you're liking this video, be sure to hit the thumbs up button and subscribe if you haven't already. USS Scorpion. Although the Cold War never erupted into direct combat between the US and the Soviet Union, both countries' militaries worked diligently to monitor the other in hopes of staying one step ahead amid ongoing tensions and fears of nuclear attack. One way the two adversaries did this was by conducting submarine surveillance and developing nuclear submarine warfare capabilities. The USS Scorpion was a 250-foot-long, nuclear-powered submarine that served in the US Navy. In February 1968, the vessel set off from Norfolk, Virginia with a 99-man crew for a 3-month deployment conducting Soviet naval reconnaissance in the Mediterranean. In mid-May, the Scorpion departed Naval Station Rota in Spain and headed back toward Norfolk. But it failed to arrive as scheduled, and the vessel's disappearance quickly escalated into a major military crisis. The Navy found the wreck off the Azores in October 1968. No official cause for the sinking was ever determined, but 1968 was an eventful year when it came to the disappearance of submarines. In addition to the Scorpion, 3 other subs vanished under mysterious circumstances, including the Israeli INS Dakar, the French Minerve, and the Soviet submarine K-129. Some believe that the Scorpion's disappearance resulted from a violent US-Soviet encounter, but other theories suggest that an accidental explosion or structural damage could have been responsible for the wreck. The wiring party. Being a member of a wiring party in World War I was often a death sentence. These men would creep out of the trenches into no man's land, the desolate space between the Allies and the Germans. The job was one which obviously needed to be done in strict secrecy and silence. They would do so under the cover of darkness to insert wiring posts ahead of the front trench. These posts were about 6 feet, 1.8 meters tall, and had to be hammered into the ground with a mallet or a giant screw-like contraption. Once the posts were placed, wire needed to be tied between them to create fences. The wire fences would prevent enemies from throwing grenades directly into the trench where the soldiers were. This was a huge issue because if enemies could get close enough to the trenches, they could just throw grenades in and blow apart all the soldiers. But putting up the wire was very deadly work. At night, the enemy would fire flares to illuminate the battlefield. If any unfortunate soldiers were caught in the open, they would be cut down by machine gun fire. Where the distance between the enemy front lines was narrow, which was actually very often the case on the trenches of the Western Front, it wasn't unusual for wiring parties of either side to encounter men from the opposing line doing the same job. When this happened, hand-to-hand fighting would often ensue. 50 military vehicles. During the Gulf War in 1991, 50 U.S. military vehicles disappeared from an American Army base in Saudi Arabia. The compound was supposedly secured, yet Humvees, 5-ton trucks, and other vehicles vanished almost nightly, according to senior officers who spoke with the LA Times. Their disappearance concerned U.S. officials about the prospect of terrorists posing as American soldiers and launching an attack. None of the vehicles were found, despite an extensive U.S. military police investigation. During the second week of the war, American commanders received intelligence reports warning of over a dozen Palestinian terrorists operating in the area, and to be vigilant about suspicious-looking foreign nationals driving civilian vehicles. Some officers speculated that U.S. soldiers were stealing the vehicles to compensate for a shortage of vehicles and spare parts at other base camps that were awaiting supplies. At the time, troops were also experiencing drastic shortages of other equipment, including chemical suits and maps. Despite suspecting terrorists of stealing many of these things, officers claimed that security was adequate to protect the military against raids. It appears as though this perplexing mystery was never solved, or if it was, the conclusion was never publicly announced. Aviators. When the war broke out in 1914, aviation was in its infant stages. The First World War saw a significant advancement in aircraft warfare. During the first months of the war, airplanes were mostly used by the British as reconnaissance. But as technology advanced very rapidly, planes evolved to join the battle. Pilots would drop bombs from their aircrafts and they would shoot down other enemy planes. Because soldiers were fighting in trenches, it was almost impossible for them to see what the enemy was doing. This meant aircrafts were needed to fly over enemy territory and photograph the situation behind enemy lines. These pictures were critical for the commanders to make the maps of what was going on. But obviously, the enemy didn't like this. Reconnaissance airplanes ended up being targeted by other reconnaissance airplanes and machine guns on the ground. This was definitely not an easy job. Pilots began targeting one another and getting locked in what became known as dogfights. Each plane tried to prevent the other from getting behind enemy lines and taking photographs. There were huge casualties, and it was one of the most dangerous jobs that a person could do. Remember, these planes were open to the weather. There were a lot of biplanes and other old vehicles used, which were dangerous enough to fly without being under constant fire from enemy guns. USS Bonhomme Richard. The USS Bonhomme Richard was a Continental Navy warship that served in the American Revolution. Originally a merchant ship for the East India Trading Company, the vessel fell under the direction of Naval Commander John Paul Jones in February 1779 as a French donation to the Patriot cause. In just weeks, the Bonhomme Richard captured 16 British vessels. But its glory days were short-lived, and in September 1779, the ship caught several bullets and was lit ablaze during the Battle of Flamborough Head in the North Sea off England's northeastern coast. Jones and his crew tried for 36 hours to keep the vessel afloat, but ultimately gave up and abandoned the ship. Shipwreck enthusiasts are still trying to find the U.S. Bonhomme Richard, and a few potential matches have been spotted, but their identity has yet to be confirmed. Finding the ship is proving to be difficult due to the sheer number of wrecks in the area, as well as over a century's worth of fishing trawler nets being dragged across the sea bottom. Moreover, authorities have not moved on identifying some wrecks due to disagreements between France and the U.S. over ownership of the Bonhomme Richard. But even if the two countries can move past all the bureaucratic red tape surrounding the vessel, there's no guarantee that anyone will ever find it. Battlefield medics. Battlefield medics haven't changed much in thousands of years. These brave medical officers rush into the dangerous battlefield to pick up wounded soldiers and take them back to a field dressing station, usually positioned just out of range of the enemy. And while medics were often considered out of bounds, after all, soldiers were still human on both sides, and it was generally agreed that you didn't shoot doctors in the face. They were still under constant threat while trying to evacuate injured people from the battlefield. In the heat of battle, medics could easily be mistaken for other soldiers. This was the #1 reason why it was so dangerous to be a medic. World War I saw the advancement of battlefield medics. By the end of the war, roughly 37 million troops had been killed. Treating those who had been injured was a huge task. So there were 3 working zones for medics. There was the collecting zone where the wounded would be taken from the battlefield, then the evacuating zone at the rear of the battlefield where transport vehicles could collect bodies, and finally the distributing zone, usually where the hospitals would be set up. However, there would always be an aid post very close to the main fighting trenches where the medical officers would be. If a soldier was injured and unable to move, the medic would need to perform their duties sometimes right in the middle of the fighting. Flight 19. In December 1945, a group of 5 TBM Avenger torpedo bombers, collectively known as Flight 19, took off from a naval air station in Fort Lauderdale, Florida for a routine training exercise. The pilots were instructed to follow a triangular flight plan that involved passing over a place called Hens and Chickens Shoals, then heading north over Grand Bahama Island and back to base. Led by experienced pilot and war veteran Lieutenant Charles C. Taylor, the flight initially went as planned. Things went awry after the crew turned north for the second leg of their trip, when Taylor became convinced that his navigation equipment was malfunctioning and that the patrol was flying in the wrong direction. Then they encountered heavy gusts and rain, further disorienting the pilots. Taylor claimed over the radio that he believed they were over the Florida Keys, which would have put them hundreds of miles off course. In hindsight, some experts believe that he got the Bahamas confused with the Keys and mistakenly believed that he and his fellow soldiers were in the Gulf of Mexico. He made the fateful decision to fly northeast, taking them further out to sea. At one point, Taylor's men convinced him to turn west, but he once again changed the flight's direction back east. Radio transmissions grew faint as the planes ran low on fuel, and Taylor instructed his men to prepare to ditch. Not only did the aircrafts and their crews vanish, but so did the Navy search team that immediately scrambled to find them by boat when they stopped communicating. An exhaustive subsequent search failed to yield any of the missing men or vehicles. But it's entirely possible, likely even, that the 5 planes from Flight 19 are still at the bottom of the Bermuda Triangle, resting in watery graves. Tank crews. Tank crews in World War I had a pretty difficult time of it as well. These tanks were primitive, often reaching a top speed of only 4 miles, 6.4 kilometers an hour. Each tank had its own crew, usually consisting of 3 drivers and 4 gunners. The interior conditions were horrendous. It was hot, noisy, and tanks drove like garbage, meaning it was also extremely uncomfortable as the tank rumbled across the uneven earth. Plus, bullets were constantly smacking into the metal plating and tanks were targeted by bombs. The last thing a tank crew wanted was to be blown up inside a hot metal box. While the movies may make tanks look fun, it was anything but. Men were often sick from driving in the tanks. The conditions were so bad inside that the tanks could only make small journeys. The people inside were literally suffocating on fumes and becoming delirious from the intense heat. Communication was also tough, and the tank officer often had to walk outside just to see what was going on. Between August and November of 1918, at least 2,400 men in the tank corps were killed fighting. USS Cyclops. Built for the U.S. Navy several years before World War I, the USS Cyclops was originally designed as a bulk coal carrier called a collier. At nearly 550 feet, it was the Navy's largest and fastest fuel ship at the time. Outfitted with 50 caliber guns, the ship carried medical staff and supplies to a French hospital during World War I. During a 9-day journey from the West Indies to Baltimore in March 1918, the manganese-laden ship and its 309 crew members vanished seemingly into thin air without even sending out an SOS. A massive search effort ensued, but the vessel remains missing to this day. No evidence of what happened to it was ever found, including no debris or oil slick. The loss of its crew is the greatest non-combat loss of lives in U.S. Navy history. Its disappearance comes with long-held rumors regarding the Bermuda Triangle, German spies, aliens, and sea monsters as possible culprits. Some people blamed the ship's captain, George W. Worley, who was allegedly a drunk who was in no suitable position to command a ship. It's also possible that the crew encountered mechanical failures or was unfamiliar with how to handle the ship while it was loaded with heavy manganese ore, a material used in steel production and that the vessel did not usually transport. To this day, the disappearance of the USS Cyclops is considered one of the most baffling military mysteries of all time. Submarine crews. Submarines were even worse than tanks. Being part of a submarine crew was often a death sentence. It was also a miserable job. According to Popular Mechanics, a typical submarine back then was about 88 feet, 27 meters long, and carried a crew of 23 people. Submarines were armed with torpedoes and 88mm 3.4-inch deck guns. But submarines were in constant danger. There were underwater mines scattered almost everywhere during World War I, all throughout the waters of Europe. These were often undetectable by the submarines, and even a slight nudge would cause the sub to blow apart and the whole crew to suffer unimaginable deaths. One of the worst parts of being in a submarine, other than the claustrophobia, the intense heat from all the machines, and the horrifying knowledge of being hundreds of feet under the water, was that when something happened, everybody died. There was no escape when a submarine was damaged, which they often were. When the unthinkable happened, all the crew members went down with the ship. The tanks of Flamenco Beach. A collection of rusting World War II-era tanks stand in stark contrast to the white sand beaches and stunning scenery of Puerto Rico's Culebra Island, where the U.S. Navy performed military tests and bomb practice starting in 1936. This went on for decades, especially as pilots trained for war in Vietnam, with 228 missiles hitting the island in 1969 alone. Locals opposed the military's use of the island and became increasingly outspoken about their disapproval the following year when they staged nonviolent protests to end the naval occupation. After 7 months of blockades, sit-ins, and marches, the Navy finally agreed to leave Culebra Island and was completely gone by 1975. But it appears as though the Navy focused more on clearing out its personnel than its equipment, as evidenced by the handful of massive graffiti-covered tanks left behind, which are still stationed along the shoreline today. 2. Chemical fighters. Chemical fighting was the most terrifying thing that happened during World War I. The terror began on April 22, 1915. German forces along the Western Front fired over 150 tons, 300,000 pounds of devastating chlorine gas at a pair of French divisions in Belgium. It was the first major gas attack by the Germans, and it killed just about every single Allied soldier on the line. The Allied soldiers had not been expecting an attack with gas. They were actually waiting for the first wave of German troops and were beginning to get worried when there was nothing but silence. Then, a literal cloud of chlorine gas floated across no man's land and into the trenches. 4 miles, 6.4 kilometers of soldiers were decimated by the gas. It was so effective and killed soldiers so quickly that the Germans didn't even know what to do. They failed to take advantage of the attack and didn't push forward, allowing the Allies to hold position. Nobody could have imagined the truly devastating effects of using chemical warfare. The second gas attack was on April 24th against a division of Canadian fighters. It was immediately after this that France and Britain began developing their own chemical weapons and supplying their soldiers with gas masks. Still, anyone caught in chemical warfare usually died. Roughly 500,000 troops were injured by toxic gas during the war, with around 30,000 deaths. Lady be good. During its first combat mission as part of the 376th Bomb Group on April 4, 1943, a U.S. Army Air Corps B-24D Liberator named Lady Be Good and its 9-man crew disappeared in the Mediterranean Sea while en route to its base in Libya after participating in a bombing raid on Naples. It was the only one of the mission's aircraft that did not return. A thorough search turned up no signs of the plane or clues about its fate, leaving officials to conclude that Lady Be Good likely went down in the sea. Then, in 1958, the plane was spotted in the Libyan desert by an oil survey exploration crew. Thanks to the arid conditions, it was well preserved, and it was evident that the aircraft had crashed. 8 of the 9 crew members' remains were found strewn throughout the desert in 1960. Along with their bodies was the diary of co-pilot Robert Toner, which revealed that the 8 men had survived the crash after overflying their base. They then walked 85 miles, desperate attempt to reach safety before 5 gave up. The remaining 3 survivors carried on for as long as they could, but they eventually perished. The fate of the missing 9th crew member remains a mystery to this day. The runner. Being a runner was one of the most perilous yet important jobs you could have during World War I. As you can imagine, communication was a bit trickier in the early 1900s. They didn't really have long-range methods of relaying messages between units. The only option was to use a telegraph, a telephone, a colored flare, or mirrors to reflect light in Morse code. They also tried to use dogs and pigeons, but these weren't always the most reliable. The best way to get a message from one place to another was to use a runner. Human runners were usually low-ranking soldiers. They were people chosen for their fitness level, along with their ability to read a map and to memorize a message. These people would be sent off in any kind of weather through some of the most dangerous areas of fighting to deliver critical information from one group to another. World War I veteran Lieutenant Alan L. Dexter was quoted in a 1931 news article saying, "With a runner, it was merely a question of how long he would last before being wounded or killed." And this was true. Runners would often have to sprint over a mile through the trenches and then out into the wilderness. And this was a dangerous thing because snipers and machine guns would try to take them out as they were running. Being a runner was basically like playing dodgeball with bullets. CH-46 Sea Knight. While the U.S. military evacuated Saigon in April 1975, a CH-46 Sea Knight helicopter piloted by 2 American pilots crashed into the South China Sea. The pair were the last U.S. pilots to die in Vietnam, and neither their bodies nor their helicopter were ever recovered. In 2016, a group of retired Marines longing for closure campaigned for the American government to search for the crashed aircraft. Named the Yankee Tango 14 Recovery Project after the chopper's ID number, the group claims to know the coordinates of the fatal disaster, which happened in waters between 65 and 100 feet, 20 to 30.5 meters deep, roughly 17 miles from the coastal city of Vung Tau. Surprisingly, not everyone with a personal connection to the tragedy supported the cause. Speaking with the San Diego Tribune in 2016, Steve Nustel, whose brother Captain William Nustel went down in the crash, said that the money it would cost to recover the wreck would be better spent caring for disabled veterans, but that his family would not object if the military decided it was appropriate to salvage the ruins and the human remains. "Let them rest in peace," he said. The government also seemed hesitant to pursue the recovery, with one official stating that underwater investigations are difficult at best due to the tendency for storms and currents to move them around on the ocean floor. It's easy to think that anyone who's lost a loved one to war would want that person brought home, but situations like this prove that it's not always the case, and that perhaps it's sometimes best to leave things and people in their original resting place. That's all for today. If you enjoyed the video, be sure to hit the thumbs up button and don't forget to subscribe. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you again next time for another amazing video right here on American Eye.